Welcome to our third in a series called A Path Forward, sponsored by the European Conservative. I'm Ellen Fantini, I'm the managing editor of the European Conservative. In this series, A Path Forward, we're looking at three of the EU's legislative priorities. In the first of our series, we did an overview of those three legislative priorities, looking at the so-called Green Deal. In this session, we'll be discussing the digital transition. And finally, we'll wrap up the series with a discussion of migration. So this event, called Coding a New Europe, will examine this digital transition. What is a digital transition? What does that even mean? What does it encompass? So we'll look at the opaqueness of the language, the discourse about this legislative topic, and it's all encompassing. Certainly, the question of digital transition, it covers everything from digital currency to QR codes being used for, access to services. Certainly, we saw that during COVID, as well as data and privacy. So it's a broad topic. We have three speakers here to try to delve into such a deep topic. I think I'll just introduce them now and get the discussion going. Each of them will speak for about 10 minutes on a specific area of this very broad topic, and then we can open up the discussion. I will perhaps prompt some further discussion, and then we'll open it to the audience to ask their own questions. So I'll start with MEP Michael Hoogeveen of the Dutch JA21 party. He's the vice chair of the Econ Committee, and he'll discuss the issue of digital currency. He'll be followed by Laetitia Pouliquin, founder of NBIC Ethics. So NBIC, nanotechnology, biotechnology, information technology, and cognitive science, who will look at the AI Act and the Data Act, both the policies and what this legislation is aiming at. And then Carlos Perona Calvete, a writer for the European Conservative. He has a background in international relations and organizational behavior. He's awaiting publication of a book exploring the metaphysics of political representation, and he will look a little more deeply at the language that's being used in this discourse and the impact of policies on European citizens. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Michael.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me here today. I'm Michael Hoogeveen. I'm an MEP for a Dutch conservative liberal party called JA21. It was only founded 2 years ago, in the year 21. And I've been an MEP since, I've been in the parliament since 2019. But I was an assistant to my predecessor called Dirk-Jan Epping, and he was elected in the national parliament. And hence I got elected for the European Parliament. So I'm here for a little bit more than 2 years now. I'm mostly focused on economic issues. So I'm a vice chair of the Economic and Monetary Committee, but I'm also a member of the International Trade Committee. So I mostly focus on, I think, the areas where the EU should focus on. And that's mostly on trade, that's mostly on economics. I think that's the original idea behind the European Union. That's why it was founded. Because free trade, it fosters prosperity for all the people, it brings jobs, it brings wealth. And I think that was really the original idea behind the European Union. So that's why I chose these specific topics to focus on in during my mandate. Before I went into politics, I worked, I'm originally a political scientist. I worked as a freelance geopolitical analyst, mostly on Northeast Asia, more specifically on North Korea. I visited the country multiple times. So, the most authoritarian regime on earth. It was a fascinating topic for me as a political scientist to study. During my time as a freelancer, I also worked, I had a regular job And I worked as in a custodian bank, securities depository bank, and later I switched to a company called KPMG. And at this company, I saw that the amount of regulatory burdens on our companies, on our small and medium-sized businesses, was getting out of control. And most of these regulations are coming from Brussels. And I saw that for the larger multinational, transnational corporations, this was not really that big of a problem in order to comply with all these rules and regulations. But I really saw that the big problem lies with our SMEs. They are not able to catch up with the incredible amount of rules and regulations that are coming, increasingly rules and regulations that are coming from Brussels. And I must say that, well, since I went into politics, I've become even more pessimistic, because in the house that's called the European Parliament, they tend to think of new things. If there's something that they don't like, is there something happening in the world that they think should be controlled, they put it into a law, and they say, well, all our companies should comply. Why shouldn't they? I'll give some examples of that later. So that's why I got into politics. First, I was a member of a political party called the VVD, which has been the ruling party in the Netherlands for more than 12 years now. But I ended my membership of that party during the Euro crisis, when our Prime Minister promised us that he would solve the Greek sovereign debt crisis, and he promised us that the Greeks would pay it back, and he came up with all kinds of solutions, and I never really believed that was the original idea behind the Economic and Monetary Union. So that's why I ended my membership with the VVD, and then I was basically politically homeless. There was not really a party in the Netherlands that was really aiming for, on the one hand, sovereignty, but on the other hand, not a party that has given up. So in the Netherlands, we would call them Nexiteers. For our British friends, we had the Brexiteers. In the Netherlands, we have the Nexiteers. And on the contrary, in Britain, the Nexit is not really a very attractive subject. So you have the fringe parties on the other hand, and the mainstream political parties in the center on the other hand, and there was nothing really center-right, and that's what JA21 steps in. We are a common sense party. We believe that the European Union is of great benefit for the Netherlands. We believe in the common market. We want to contribute to the common market, but we don't believe in all these bureaucratic rules and regulations coming from Brussels. I just touched upon it briefly, but the things I'm seeing right now coming from the parliament, they want, I mean, we already have very stringent rules on accounting, on fiscal rules and regulations, but they come up with all kinds of new things. You touched upon it briefly, the green regulation, which is coming from Brussels, the digital regulation, the privacy regulation that's coming from Brussels, the gender regulation, they're now working on it. So we need to prove that we are paying, the equal work, equal pay directive, that every company needs to prove that every man and every woman works the same amount of hours, gets the same amount of money paid in their hourly wage. They have to report it, obviously. Companies have to comply. They have to hire in auditors or consultants. Another file I'm working on right now is forced labor, where companies have to prove they're basically guilty until proven otherwise. So you are trading in certain products, then you must be trading in forced labor. If you don't, well, prove it. So that's really the way people in Brussels think. And they don't think with a business mindset. They don't think with a common sense mindset. They think they can regulate everything from top to bottom. And that's also what brings us to one of the files I'm also working on in the Econ Committee, and that is on the digitalization of payments. I'm a rapporteur on a file called instant payments. If we look at the European Common Market, in the Netherlands itself, we have a system. If I transfer my money to a Dutch friend, it's instantly transferred to one another's bank account. But within the common market, if I would transfer, where do you live? France. Belgium. Well, Belgium. If I would transfer money from my Dutch bank account to your Belgian account, then it would still take 2 or 3 working days. So we are now working on a project that really makes these transfers instant, and I think that's really some added value of the European Union. We already saw this with the roaming on the mobile phones. I mean, these are things that people are actually happy about when it comes from the EU. So that's one of the files I'm working on, and then the other file, and that's really connected to the instant payments. That's also something I've been busy with. It's not assigned to me yet, because the proposal is still at the European Commission, but that's the digital currency, so the digital euro. And I've been following this project ever since I worked in banking. I followed the rise of Bitcoin. When Bitcoin was introduced, it truly revolutionized the world of finance. For the people who don't know what Bitcoin is a decentralized payment system, which really is secure, it's fast, it's cheap, and it doesn't need any financial intermediaries such as a bank or a central bank. So really revolutionized the world of finance, and it in theory it could create a lot of freedom for people, because you're no longer connected, you're no longer obliged to be connected to banks, or you're no longer reliant on the policies of the central bank. What we've seen, that they're grinding money printing press policies have spiraled inflation out of control. So it offered a tremendous amounts of freedom, but it also, with that development, also came obviously the dark side of what the crypto community or the Bitcoin community has come with, and that's money laundering, that's criminal activities that were really propagated by the use of Bitcoin. So what do they do in Brussels? They think, well, this is a really promising technology. Why don't we embrace it? And they embraced it via what is now called the Digital Euro Project, or what is also called a central bank digital currency. And they are currently experimenting with it, and we have regular dialogues with the European Central Bank. Its program manager on the digital euro is Fabio Panetta. And he comes to the European Parliament to give talks about where this is going, the digital euro, and why is he having this project. And this is really where it comes down, where I asked the question to him multiple times, why do we need a digital euro? Because as I said, I'm already working on the Instant Payments Directive. The digitalization of finance is already there. So what are the benefits of a digital euro if you have Bitcoin, but it still relies on these centralized institutions, such as a central bank or a financial intermediary? And the question, and he answered the question basically by saying, well, we need it because they are doing it in China. In China, they are currently developing they already introduced the E1, the digital renminbi. And the Chinese government is really trying to push this to their own people by making sure that people use these digital currencies. Why? Well, and that is basically what a Chinese official said at the IMF in October last year when I was there. He said the main benefit of a digital currency is programmability. What is programmability? Is that, for example, if you have something like food stamps. Food stamps, well, in the Netherlands, there have been quite some scandals with subsidies that were given to people, and they were not used for the designated for the things they were meant to be spent on. And with these programmability, you could just say, well, I give you a certain amount of programmable digital money that you can only spend on food or on solar panels. So that's really what they're doing in China. And the European Central Bank told me that they are now moving towards this digital euro because of China, because they think it's an attack on the reserve world currency. But I also asked them, do you want this programmability included in the digital euro? And he said no. He promised me that was not the case. So and I asked him all sorts of other questions concerning privacy, and he basically confirmed that this was not the case. So then again, my question was, why do we need a digital euro? Why do we need it? And that question hasn't been answered to me fully. And I agree that they are experimenting with this technology. I mean, you should always, it's always in business, I've learned that you have the famous Kodak moment. If you remember the old cameras from Kodak, they didn't move along with the digital cameras. So they in the end, they went bust. So I also always believe that you should embrace technology, experiment with technology. But they are now moving ahead by actually introducing this digital euro. And I think if the European Central Bank doesn't want to have all these so-called benefits that they are now having in China, then what's the use case of a digital euro? And I think it's a solution looking for a problem which can only confuse people, which can only confuse the financial sector. But what is this exactly? So I said to the European Central Bank, okay, experiment with it, talk about it, do with it whatever you want, but put it on ice. Don't introduce this into legislation. So that's where I'm at. I think I ran out of my 10 minutes, and I think we can continue our discussion. Thank you.
I think you've left us wanting to ask some questions, so that's a perfect stopping point. I'll move it now to Laetitia to help us navigate some more policies coming from the EU.
Thank you, Ellen. Does this work? No.
Yes.
Yes, okay. So NBIC Ethics is a think tank that I founded in 2017 because of the civil law rules on robotics and AI resolution at the European Parliament that got adopted, including a universal salary and to compensate the use of AI and robots on the employment workforce, and that was actually juggling with the idea of creating a legal status for robots and AI, automated robots, I'm sorry. So I jumped on the wagon and felt that it was really worth investigating ethics, the whole thing. And then, of course, came up in 2020, the roadmap for digitalization from Ursula von der Leyen came up, and with a whole array of regulation directives. And so I rolled my sleeves up, and felt that Data Act and AI Act was worth amending and commenting and even overthrowing somehow. So on the basis of what you just mentioned, too much regulation, but also ethical issues, which is my perspective. So basically what I'd like to offer you this morning is a very quick overview of what Data Act and AI Act encompasses, and then ask and challenge what the formal and informal intentions of the European Commission are, and then conclude with a burning question, which would be what future lies ahead of us with a coded EU. That's quite a program, so I'll make it very short, I promise. So speaking of ethics, I just want to set things right. For me, it's a fundamental reflection of European people in order to establish standards, norms, limits, and duties from a very cultural, religious, and a political philosophy point of view. And I think it's worth mentioning, because ethics, usually for the GAFAMs and the BADICs of this world, means computational ethics, which is something really different, based on the Asilomar principles that were put together 10 years ago, which are very valid, but it's just, computational. So basically, I'm going back to the charters and the conventions of the EU. So AI Act, let's start with AI Act. Bear with me. A very long and complex regulation that led to 3,000 amendments tabled in 2022, that finally got squeezed into 11 compromise amendments in the latest IMCO and LIBE committee session vote by 88 votes, adopted by 88 votes to 17, I guess. And then that was 2 weeks ago. But then those compromise amendments are actually collated to the actual draft report, and what remains is still very strong ethical shortcomings. I had initially with NBIC proposed and commented and helped political groups table some amendments on things like lack of definition, like bias, like human-centered AI. What does this mean? Does this, if it's not defined, how can you possibly activate it? I would have loved to see the prohibited AI list inflated with things like genetic and behavioral profiling, like protecting cognitive integrity, because with the use of brain implants, of course, you can get hacked, and your personality is no longer protected. In defense, prohibition of lethal autonomous weapons, which was subject to a resolution, but yet it needs to be added to a formal regulation. In terms of high-risk AI systems, things like automation, mechatronics, and robotics have been put aside, which is a nonsense to me. Emotion detection, signature ID, and mental reading that gathers brain activity data into speech, to convert it into speech. Those things have been put aside. So for a regulation that tries and look forward, do some forward thinking, I really tend to challenge it. In terms of human rights, as I've already hinted at, high-risk AI as well as non-high-risk AI need to be protected in terms of human rights. There's been no pragmatic approach whatsoever to freedom of speech, to freedom of behavior. No practical demands or provisions made to developers, unlike with the actual AI ethical guide that I contributed to from the European Commission was defining, but of course these guidelines were stringent rules. So basically, we're down to a list that is being described by the Future of Life Institute, basically the OpenAI and the GAFAMs of those worlds. Transparency, responsibility, privacy, shared benefit, and discrimination are the essence of what they define as human rights. And I tend to challenge them into more. We are much, as human beings, we're much more than that. So what with the NBIC, we tried to put forth three things that I would like for you to go home with. One, an opt-out option. I would challenge that an AI-based decision process, if you're forced into an automated decision without being offered an option to opt out and have a recourse to a human-based decision, then we're not talking about freedom. We're not included the vulnerable whatsoever. And the internet gap doesn't play a role here because there are many people that are not internet savvy. And then, so this opting out mechanism seems to me as a very important step forward. Now, a three-level human-machine interaction labeling, tagging would make sense to me as well. Is it solely machine AI-based decision-making process? Is it half and half, i.e., AI automated decision supervised by human and in the end, or is it fully human? We've seen OpenAI now suggesting that ChatGPT generated, or rather DALL-E generated images should be tagged as artificial intelligence generated images. So down the same alley, to protect our human rights, I would really like to the European Commission to make a step forward and see how they can integrate something of that sort. Now, the legislative process on AI Act at this point is that, as I just mentioned, the IMCO and LIBE committees have agreed on compromise amendments, and that will be added to the AI Act draft report, draft regulation to be voted probably in June. This coming June, and the compromise amendments really had some interesting input, like a full ban on facial recognition, like generative AI, such as ChatGPT, included in high-risk AIs, which is good, and measures to build and grow AI literacy in the general population. I'm really appreciative of, but we're very far from reaching the goal, and I truly believe that those compromise amendments are the forest hiding the trees, the trees hiding the forest. I'm sorry. So technological trust, trust, is this the new God? Is trust the only thing that would validate such a regulation? I don't think so. Data Act, moving on to Data Act, which is actually officially called Regulation and Harmonized Rules on Fair Access to Use in Data. I will quote the European Commission proposal, the introduction, how they justify this. They say, the volume of data generated by humans and machines have increased exponentially in recent years. However, most data sit idle, or its value is concentrated in the hands of a relatively small number of large companies. It's therefore crucial to unlock the potential by providing opportunities for data reuse, as by removing obstacles to the development of the European data economy in accordance with the European rules and in full respect of European values. So values seem to be at the center, but innovation is too, and I'm sure you'd be appreciative of that in your very pragmatic approach and common sense approach. But to me, this European data economy, as you mentioned, the digital economy, is this truly needed? And what it's meant to be and to become? Is there any programmation behind it? Trilogue discussions on Data Act has actually already begun. And my 2 cents is that it will pass just 100%. With a very strong vote. People will, and the European Council will ratify it very quickly before the end of the mandate. This is my 2 cents. We'll see what comes up. But basically what the principles of the Data Act is that users of connected objects have the right to access and share the data that they have helped generate. Data transfers for consumers. Consumers can actually sell the data. They can change cloud providers. International transfer of data need to be located in Europe, and companies will not be able to use the data that they receive to develop a competing product. And B2G, business to government, aims at the Act aims at empowering the public sector bodies to request data from private companies in exceptional circumstances, such as in response of a public emergency. Margarita de la Pisa from your group, ECR, in the last plenary, in the February plenary, I guess, she's a member of EMPL and FEM, she raised some major issues of sovereignty, as well as possible centralized agenda. She says, dear colleagues, let's be honest, the EU is lagging behind in the data battle, now led by China and the US, and the Commission has done so with the proposal that aims to accumulate more power and conform to an agenda without measuring how this affects our corporate fabrics and our lives as citizens. And that goes back to the extra administrative work and red tape put forth on SMEs. But what I see as more important is that her speech actually echoes a mistrust vote from 133 MEPs who actually rejected or abstained, including 22 ECR members, despite the massive support on data. The actual massive support in the plenary vote. Data and AI Act, they both lack really and make sovereignty issues crucial, and the respect for human rights need to be the motto, not trust, not transparency, not explicability. So moving on to my point 2 and point 3, what are the possible European Commission's formal and informal goals in legislating and typically with Data and AI Act. And I'll show you that there's a stream of other regulation coming up. So is it ethics? Is it because we invented ethics, human rights in Europe? Maybe. Is it because we want to protect EU sovereignty in a fight with China and the USA, where Europe is actually lagging in terms of innovation and dominance, for sure? But is this going to bring a ghettoing effect? Possibly. Do we want to create more norms, more laws, and possible centralization, leading to a possible social credit system? Data and AI, you've understood, are highly intertwined and interrelated, because data is the fuel and AI is the engine, if I may use a metaphor, a very trivial metaphor. But basically the building blocks of new norms, new control, and new EU centralization. What's been the proof of concept of that it's coming, that centralization is actually coming, are twofold. One, the European Centre for Algorithmic Transparency has been launched last March in Sevilla. And also the European EU Justice portal, has been conceived as a future electronic one-stop shop in the area of justice. Green Pass, you mentioned. Certificate of Parenthood, in terms of gender issue. All of this brings together more norms. And then there are three important regulations that are coming up as well that I'd like to mention and put thoughts today in perspectives, is the e-health data space, as well as the European Digital Identity Framework, and the so-called chat control regulation for minors, which is actually officially called child sexual abuse online. What that means is that they'd be able to read every single of your messages for the sake of proving that you're not a sexual predator. E-health, what that means is that the EU would possibly have access in times of pandemic or emergency of whatever sort to access your health data in every member state. Digital identity, you do understand that because President von der Leyen has actually expressed it openly, is that she aims with ID framework, which is already a directive, or a regulation rather, with this revamping of this regulation. She aims at making sure that we can identify ourselves, but also pay tax, public health, as well as pensions, as well as social allowances and such. All of this centralized. So loss of freedom, basically. Very strong loss of freedom is what I see. Standardization of our relationships between persons, companies, and governments. Now, Estonia, Belgium, other countries are really quite ahead with those initiatives already. But I would like to put forth and demonstrate that social credit is in process, is already progressing. Two examples, the city of Bologna. So Bologna just launched an experimental smart citizen wallet to promote virtuous citizenship. Based on waste sorting, there you go, the use of public transportation, no debt or sanctions with public authorities. And France, with Thales Group, has launched this initiative of a digital ID wallet that they allow, quote unquote, that would allow, quote unquote, public authorities to create a digital platform for identity document aiming at identifying you, reducing administrative work, and supporting the digital economy. What? Excuse me, but what does this exactly means? So finally, my thoughts about what the future lies ahead, and this was a special request from the European Conservative. As we have the summit coming up on transhumanism, I'm actually publicizing at this point in September. So given the fact that we actually leave digital prints everywhere we go, on the internet via, giving away a personal data, personal behavior, the meter down the street when you park and pay. It allows them, the company, to actually know who you are, where you park, and where you're going shopping, and where and when. So basically, we have the ability to know exactly everything about yourself. So with the advent of very intrusive and manipulative AI systems, as well as the use of massive data preemption and predation, consequences, in my views, are threefold. An EU centralized data platform will make social credit technologically possible and lawful if those acts pass. Technically, at this point, legally, at this point, it's only in case of pandemic, terrorist attack, public threat, and infrastructure emergency. But technically, it will be feasible. Member states' authority will be undermined, obviously, with a centralized system. So a non-elected body ruling the roost, is that exactly what we want? I don't think so. And we've seen this in many other, you mentioned equal pay directive, it's just the same. Actually, they don't mention men and women anymore.
Oh, yeah.
They mention, and women have become, mothers have become pregnant persons, right? European citizens, thirdly, are already monetized with VLOPs, very large online platforms, on our behavioral and merchant basis. That we know. There are some think tanks actually challenging, social network use, and they say social networks kill, especially the youth. And so with more AI systems and data in our lives, and some of it being accessible directly by governments, by law, we would potentially be subject to a reward system for virtuous citizens, and shaming and naming would become possible for bad citizens. Closing remarks. Sure. And I know I've gone way beyond my time. Trust and technology in itself are not gods. Trust in AI and data serve a transhumanist agenda. That's for sure. Making a difference between the good citizens, the bad citizens, the ones that are enhanced and the ones that are lagging behind in terms of technology. We are not looking at greater good of humanity with this agenda. Greta Thunberg keeps on saying, listen to the science, but I say no science and tech will abide to a code of honor, to the word given, to demonstrate integrity like human being does, exercise gift of self. If in any coded moral agency, we won't achieve this. So I'd like to encourage all of us in this room to strive to build a technological humanism based on human intelligence, which is far beyond what general AI would ever reach in zeros and ones, and accept vulnerability and be grateful for the reality that the world that we live in, flesh and blood. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I think my notebook is going to fill up before we even get to the Q&A. So much food for thought there. I'll turn it over to Carlos to make his comments both on what's been said and his observations of where we're headed.
Sure. First of all, microphone working? Yeah. My voice isn't that loud usually. Thank you very much to my co-panelists. That was very insightful indeed, and to attendees. My remarks will be, in a sense, more general. I mean to tease out some of the ideological presuppositions that seem to be operating in the minds of policymakers in Europe. And one of the ways in which we can do that is by addressing the language and the idiosyncratic language that they use, that they invoke. The first obvious example of that would be the fact that the digital agenda from the Commission, published I think a year ago, I think in June last year, at the end of June, uses the term digital transformation. It's not digitalization of public services in general, transparencies being guaranteed. Digital transformation. On one level, that comes from the private sector, transforming normal processes by integrating digital technology, but also producing new methods, new processes, new pathways made possible by digital technology. Now, interestingly, digital transformation is often touted as the principal means through which we attain the Agenda 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. So the IBM published on that, and I think the UNDP has talked about that quite a bit as well. And both for the Commission and for the UN, the conceptual framework justifying digital transformation has to do with this new term. It's kind of a difficult to pin down term, resilience, increasing social resilience. And in fact, digital transformation in the European context is being funded, I think, to the tune of 250 billion euro with a B from the Recovery and Resilience Instrument of the Next Generation EU. So resilience matters. Anecdotally, I was told by a coworker, I think 3.5 years ago, working on European funds, on consulting for European funds, that resilience, that doesn't really have to do primarily with economic downturns and supply chain shocks and all the rest of it. It's not being resilient to forces external to your society. Really what matters is becoming resilient to threats within the society. And this coworker used the term populism. What was implied was a certain kind of populism, a certain kind of wrong think. That was already odd, but I think if you look to the Commission and to a lot of the publications that are coming out from the Joint Research Center, which is an organ whose job it is to produce analysis and reports and discussion largely justifying Commission policy priorities, you find that that's exactly the case. So I want to quote a little bit from some JRC papers because, it can be shocking the degree to which this is really out in the open. In 2020, the JRC produced a paper called Towards a Transformative Resilience. So already their transformation of digital transformation and resilience are linked together. Just very briefly, one of the passages that that you find there has it that we are subject to all kinds of crises. Mainly the COVID-19 crisis is being invoked, but obviously climate change has more staying power as the crisis that justifies policy decisions. And we read the following. The crisis should become an opportunity to progress and bounce forward. Transformations do not only include technical and technological changes, that would be the stuff we can maybe all agree on, but also cultural changes, behavioral shifts, institutional reforms. They question values. They change priorities, challenge beliefs, identities, and stereotypes. End quote. That's odd. At minimum, that's odd because the Commission has no purview, it has no mandate to be challenging anybody's beliefs and certainly not to alter identities. If we want more detail, we can go to the Commission's resilience dashboard and they break down the concept of resilience very helpfully into all kinds of sub-indices. Digital technology is one of the 4 principal axes of that dashboard. Still a prototype, it's still a draft, but we don't expect great changes. The others are green, socioeconomic issues, and geopolitics. But in terms of digital transformation and how it contributes to resilience, we find things like, well, increasing the total percentage of bachelor and master's degrees in a member state in the area of digital, specifically AI is mentioned. So it's not apprenticeships, and it's not plumbers, and it's not philosophy, and it's not literature, and it's not engineering in the old sense, or biologists that increase your resilience. It's adapting your workforce to these new 4th generation industrial revolution, as Carl Schwab would call them, sectors, becoming very adapted to that which is coming down the pike. So again, we get the sense, you're not the one whose resilience is being looked out for. It's the system's resilience that's really being measured here. Another odd index here is the issue of social media. The more percentage or the larger the number of people in your society that have a social media account or many social media accounts and participate in social media, the more resilient you are as a society. Why? According to the dashboard, it's because you are now increasing the influence of new governing structures. New governing structures. What does that mean? The influence of new governing structures. This is just one rabbit hole that we can pursue. But if we do pursue it and we look up what that means on the Commission's website, they point us towards another JRC paper. This one is called The Future of Government 2030 Plus, which I think means 2030 and beyond, also conceptually, the 2030 Agenda and beyond. All right. Another interesting quote comes out of that paper, because there they admit, yeah, of course, there's all kinds of problems with social media, hate speech, fake news, the kind of stuff that you'd expect the Commission to complain about. But these social media platforms also allow you to participate with other people and have discussions in ways that break down old patterns of participation in the public sphere. Citizenship and so forth can be challenged. So I'm just going to read a few quotes. It lionizes concepts that are more flexible, forms of citizenship and identification, cosmopolitan citizenship, and so forth. And then it says the following when thanking contributors to this paper. Interesting explorations into the intertwining of real and virtual self, the extended self, transhumanism, it's mentioned there, extended self, transspecies, I think they mean transspeciesism, that comes up, where the concepts of citizenship and identity are pushed to the limits of collective involvement in society. The body is seen as an open project, and transhumanism is used to resist the hegemonic norms of a society. Again, odd, and definitely beyond the purview of the Commission. But there it is. You can download that from the Commission website, justifying one of the sub-indices to do with digital transformation and how it increases resilience. But that doesn't just stay at the level of the Commission. It touches down. Because if you look at the terms of reference of specific framework contracts, if you want to access certain European funding, you have to conform yourself to that language. And that comes up in, for example, I have it's one example among many examples, but if you look at the context section of the terms of reference for DG research and innovation, this would be for producing evaluation tools in order to assess that new technologies are properly being integrated into a certain business process, into a certain public service. And we read that, you know, the bottlenecks to change are often social, institutional, psychological, legal. I would highlight psychological. Effective diffusion of technological advancements also requires changing societal structures and human behavior, end quote. So you as an entity have to somehow justify that your project is altering human behavior to get access to what should be a very obvious, technical, straightforward funding mechanism. I would suggest then that the issue of digital transformation is mixed in with very spurious and to a large degree very dangerous ideas in the mind of policymakers and people contributing to the policy formulation process. Obviously, political elites in the West perhaps are subject to a hypercriticality when it comes to inherited institutions, identities, all the rest of it. The assumption is that what you inherit is problematic and has to be modified in really thorough ways. And they're also subject to a certain techno-optimism. Whatever is new is good. To the degree that you adopt it, you're going to be in a better place than your parents and grandparents were. But there's also a monetary incentive here. Both of my co-panelists have touched on that. Right? If my fridge used to represent a euro sign for the fridge manufacturer and the energy company because I keep it plugged in, now it represents a euro sign for the sensor manufacturer because it's fitted. That's what the Internet of Things is. All these appliances are going to be fitted in with a sensor telling some database, me, the household, but maybe somebody else, how often I open the fridge and what I'm doing with the fridge. If I ever turn the fridge off during winter, you know, to be more climate change conscious, whatever it happens to be. So there is a monetary issue there, especially if these producers of that new technology are concentrated. There's a few of them. And if it happens to go hand in hand with a downturn and inflation wipes out the value of some of our savings, there would be an increase in inequality there. It's interesting that oftentimes elite projects break down or become very critical of established identities at the same time as this kind of thing goes on, because I think inherited identities often are the locus of resistance. This is really what binds people together in being able to critique and in being able, in finding mutual aid and mechanisms outside of what's already established to help each other we've also mentioned control. That's another obvious motivation. The libido dominandi, the lust of domination, as St. Augustine would say, that's always at play. And a lot of these technologies, exactly what they do. They increase the information that you have. I mean, really, the justification for producing supercomputers and digital twins of the world's climate systems, like the Destin-E project that's being developed, sits very poorly with green priorities because the carbon footprint would be massive. So there's other things at play there. What would a quote-unquote conservative approach to technological innovation be like? You know, first, and I think this was also touched on previously, the idea that when you have identities, morality, behavior being talked about here, you have to be very clear. This is the purview of moral deliberation, moral calculus, even aesthetic choices that we make, and that we make often over the course of generations. It has nothing to do with a technical advancement, digital or otherwise. So these things respond to different spheres. Digital technology should be instrumental to that which is prior to the digital technology, which is our moral deliberation, which is how we as a society make these decisions and how we identify. I would like, if we have time, to very briefly quote from a work that was published some time ago called The Politics of Virtue by a theologian, Anglo-Catholic, John Milbank, and a post-liberal type, Adrian Pabst. They touched on this, and I think they put it very well, because they talked about how to engage with technology in a non-debilitating way, which really means, why do we atrophy memory? Why do we atrophy our natural mental agility? Why should a child not learn first to do math in their head and keep that habit their whole life, and then to use an abacus so they can visualize what numbers are, what mathematical relations look like, and then you use a calculator. If you do the opposite, if you put the, you know, if you use the latest high tech for even very low tech uses, you will become a weaker subject. You will debilitate yourself. I think that was a very apt way to put it. They also concluded with the following: technology remains a crucial ally of human reason and creativity. It is crucial that students of all ages still be taught to draw, handwrite, knit, sew, weave, make pots, ride horses, sail boats, etc. That's exactly right. The human subject has to be the locus. We have to think about what faculties are essential to human behavior, to human thought, etc. Cultivate those first, and then use technology instrumentally afterwards, so that we've integrated and strengthened ourselves, our children, rather than ultimately weakening them. And Plato makes the same point in the Timaeus, interestingly. So, but thank you very much, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you all to all of our speakers for these really thought-provoking introductory remarks, and I think we're left with perhaps more questions than we had before you spoke, and the theme that I see emerging, which perhaps we all suspected might emerge, but has come into greater focus, goes to this question that Michael raised to his lack of satisfaction, the question why. So we keep on noticing or being shown what's behind the curtain, but it's never completely transparent about why. Why do we need this? As Michael said, well, why do we need the digital euro? Well, because they're doing it in China. I mean, when has that ever been a good idea for any of our policies, particularly ones that relate to human beings? And what's the difference between answering, well, do we need social credit systems? Well, sure. Well, they're doing it in China. I mean, at what point is that answer simply just going to be laughable? I mean, I think the answer is now, but what do you think?
Well, I think that if you look at the question of why, the European Central Bank is saying it not necessarily because China is doing it internally, but they think they think geopolitically. So it's a geopolitical argument for them. So they think that China is now attacking the dollar as the world reserve currency. And it wants, if it would have the choice, it would do it tomorrow. It would like to switch gears and like to change the world reserve currency from the dollar to the renminbi. So you would have your oil would be transferred in renminbi, etc. So the fear that the European Commission has, the European Central Bank, European policymakers have, is that this digital renminbi, they would be ahead of the curve. They would be technologically more advanced in introducing this digital currency. That's why they are saying we need to work on this now, because we need to make sure that when China becomes dominant, we have a counterbalancing. So that's basically their argument. But my argument against that is, well, there's not really an added value then for a digital euro in our current payments landscape. And if you look at what the EU1 is now doing, it only accounts in China for 0.13% of the total volume of money in circulation in China. So it's not really a very successful endeavor so far for the Chinese government. So again, my question was, or my remarks were, sure, if there's a new technology, look into it. If there's a danger of you being outperformed in terms of innovation, go for it. Experiment with it. Talk about it with policymakers. Make sure you can put it in the fridge, and when it's geopolitically necessary, you can always put it out. But why introduce this now? It's a totally redundant product. And there's one more argument they are giving, and that's I think is the most laughable argument, is that they use the argument of financial inclusion, which is where they say, well, all these legacy banking infrastructure, some people don't have a regular bank account. So we need to include all the people, and with a central bank digital currency, with a digital euro, you don't need a traditional bank account. But 95% of the people in Europe already have bank accounts. So there is no reason to introduce this in Europe. It might help in a country like Botswana, where there are no legacy banking systems. You could introduce a central bank digital currency in order to make it financially more inclusive for the people there to get access to digital money. But for Europe, it's a totally redundant argument. So for me, that's really the story behind the digital euro.
I think this idea of a solution in search of a problem is a theme that runs throughout much of this. Not only are these policies creating solutions for problems that don't exist or aren't really problems, but there's a bit of, let's say, social engineering in suggesting that there's a problem that needs this solution when the problem doesn't really exist. Laetitia, do you think that's the case? Have you seen that happening?
Well, definitely. You've heard in my speech somehow with the advent of a technical solution to actually switch on social credit at some point. One cannot be technophobic because it does bring about social progress, that's for sure. Take health research, take banking for all somehow in countries outside of the EU. That is, and just cellular technology, just GSMs, just this speaks for itself. However, we've jumped, we've made a huge leap in the unknown at this point. And I agree with the fridge theory. Put this aside, let's think of it. Amazingly enough, actually, just now, as we speak, there's a demonstration to pause AI in front of the Microsoft Innovation Center. Out in Rue Montoyer. So it's just, pausing AI, is that something that we can do, that we can achieve? Is this what the EC wants? That is an absolute no. Social reengineering is coming up and it is likable. What you've mentioned, what you've quoted from JRC is actually very striking, and I should go through these papers as well. Social credit, what's interesting is actually the perspective of social credit in China versus what we understand of it in Western countries is quite different somehow. They don't have the green perspective, that's for sure. They see, and this is philosophically and religiously enshrined in their cultures for millions of years, if I may say. They see a population as a block. It's a community. It's not individuals. So the naming and shaming does work for them. As for in terms of social credit in Europe, in Western countries, but more specifically in Europe, what we'd see is a sense of guilt. And they've already built this into our fabric with green economy. Every time you take you jump on a train or in a plane, don't you feel guilty? I do. No, you don't. Okay, well then, I do. It's in the back of my mind, and that's where the green pass jumps in. So you see, they're actually fostering a new behavior, a new psychological ability, and a pervasive social engineering in us, and it's already there.
Okay, I think this is the perfect opportunity to take questions or comments from the audience. Certainly, there's plenty of provocative material to ask about or to challenge. Does anyone have a comment or question they'd like to ask any of the panelists? Okay, well, so I guess we all agree, and that's it. Yes, there's a question here.
Well, it's a comment, really, rather than a question. As to your big questions about why and the digital transformation, I think that what hasn't been said, and I think which is probably the key question, is that the EU is doing this because it's weak. If you look at what they're doing in all the spheres of digital, the kind of regulatory zeal that they go about, as you say, the proliferation of all these laws, I think what's happening is they are attempting to regulate or referee the world through basically using the power of access to the single market as the mechanism through which they can impose their values and their interests on above everybody else. So that's, if you look at the GDPR, it's now become a global standard. And this has really gone to the heads of the commissioners because they think they can do this with the AI Act, with all the other acts that are coming in, the child sexual abuse stuff, what you're saying, completely agree. This is going to be a fundamental attack on all of our privacies, on our right to think, because they're going to snoop on everything we can say now, digitally. The point I'm trying to make is that what's driving this is geopolitics. It's a very, very critical point. I mean, there is an internal dynamic to this, of course, which is the Commission's absence of its awareness of its absence of legitimacy within the nation states. The fact that it is unaccountable, etc. But I think the critical thing is that what they're attempting to do is to use their muscle to play a role in the geopolitical thing. And it's a really dangerous game because rather than focusing on what Europe could do to become a player in this, to your point, Michael, about, startups, the regulation that, completely ties small and medium enterprises, startups, etc., that they just cannot compete in this. And it's this kind of, they've globalized the precautionary principle. In other words, if we don't know what the outcome is, then let's control it. And it's a highly dangerous thing because not only does it affect innovation very, very badly, but it actually means that Europe is not in a position to, in the long term, compete in this space. Because, when the US introduces an Artificial Intelligence Act, which they're all debating now. Where does that leave Europe? When you don't have technologies to regulate, because you're regulating everybody else's technologies, then you're left with you're up the creek without a paddle, essentially.
Right. Well, as you were speaking, I was thinking about the word resilience, and this is this word that is used across so many of these initiatives. And just as an ordinary person, thinking about the ordinary meaning of what it means to be resilient, it seems that so much of this is actually the opposite of fostering resilience. So wouldn't it be a measure of resilience to find out, to train people to repair refrigerators, for example? Thinking about how to compete, the resilience of communities, small businesses, family businesses, to remain resilient in the face of globalization. It seems that it's really the opposite of what we think of as resilience as their goal here. Comments based on what was just said.
He addressed your.
Yeah, no. I think you were spot on in this. Really, I think if you talk about the why from the European institutions, it's always the geopolitical argument. They say this strategic autonomy. It didn't just come out of the head of President Macron. I mean, these are things that have been discussed at length in the European Commission, European Council, European Parliament, and really, if you look at geopolitics, we see the rise of China. We see, we want to become less dependent on the United States, whether you agree or not. That's basically what the European institutions are saying. And with these regulations, especially in the digital atmosphere, all of the time I heard the phrase, we need to be a global leader. And that's exactly as you said with the GDPR, but also, for example, the MiCA, which was just passed through Parliament, that's also seen as we are now a global leader. We will set the global standards. So it's really a geopolitical argument. I completely agree. Yeah.
Just to bring that in very quickly, I mean, in terms of SMEs, they are brought into the picture way downstream, right? They will deliver certain services using technology developed somewhere else, produced somewhere else. I think you're right about that. I think that, there is some attempt at developing European industry, semiconductors, the CHIPS Act. But yeah, overall, I think that what you're seeing is an increase in dependence. It's not, resilience really means reliance on externals, and then that makes the system resilient, but not you, not the nation state, and not societal resilience is what's being addressed there. SMEs, I mean, it's a shame that there isn't, because you could imagine a lot of this funding going towards developing local industry. I think rhetorically, discursively, politicians will invoke the small, medium enterprise in order to make it seem as though what they're doing would increase economic differentiation and dynamism and all the rest of it. But the reality is that all of the value added is, again, way upstream of that. So I think that there's a bit of a bait and switch when that gets invoked. I know in Spain that's the case, because every now and then the government will refer to small and medium enterprises, but what they're doing and the way that they structured their recovery and resilience plan has nothing to do with increasing the weight in the economy of entrepreneurs, right? So I think that there's a little bit of a trick that they pull with that term, unfortunately. Yeah.
I'd like to say that there's, in my view, there's a hidden agenda to the hidden agenda, which is not so hidden, actually, because since the JRC has been so open-minded and has been putting this in writing. But geopolitics is actually a false argument, a hidden, an argument that they put forth so that we let go. Because honestly, it's so hard to contradict such a strong argument. We don't want to end up in a World War III, and we want to be strong and protect our societies. So basically, that sells off. But if you see through the lines, I see something that is much bigger than that. And I see, you mentioned social reengineering, but I see something that leads us to the death of humanity. And I mean it. In that what they're trying to do is with machine-human interactions, with the woke wave, which makes races mixed up, which is actually looking into mixing human beings with animals. This is what they already do in bioethics around the world. So all of those mixing leads to the crush of families, the crush of generations. Our children will be far more resilient, far more technologically advanced, far more improved, and with technology. And in this transhumanist wave coming our way, we see that the philosophical approach, materialistic approach of our leaders is taking a low hand over our beings, of who we are really as peoples of relations, peoples of the word, peoples, 5 hours spent on social networks a day from within the young population, 5 hours. That means you're not going sewing, you're not going outside to garden, you're not speaking to people, and all of this is actually the death of our fabric, of who we are. I went to Rome for the General Assembly of the Pontifical Academy of Life in 2017 on robotics. It was called Roboethics. And I was amazed to see that all the researchers and mechatronics experts and all the in all cultures, be it there were some Koreans, there was some Taiwanese, there were some American, all of them, they could not give an answer of who a human being is. So if you can't define who a human being is, how can you possibly say what differs from a human being with a machine?
I think that's a great launching off point for at least a comment or a question from the audience. What do people think about that? I mean, we've seen the rhetorical success of asking the question, "What is a woman?" as it relates to gender ideology today. But this question, "What is a human being?" Certainly, I think it's shocking probably to many people that that's not easily answered. I mean, the idea that people would struggle to answer that question is chilling, I think.
Well, I may add a response there. Well, I think we're now in a society that's going faster and faster than ever, and it's difficult and more difficult for people to keep up. And it's tempting with all these changes to try and connect the dots and try to make sense of everything is happening and try to encompass into one direction where we think things are going. But the fact is that we don't. And in that sense, I still believe... I believe that in the rule of law and in freedom and democracy, and I think our institutions are still embedded also on these principal values. And I think they will also take this into account when talking about moving to regulation, when moving innovations to the digital sphere. So I don't really believe in a sense of that we are going to this mass Chinese-style surveillance society. I don't believe that. I do believe, however, it comes with challenges. And when we look at regulation, that we need to safeguard the rule of law. We need to safeguard freedom of speech. So I think that's just a very important element. But I always try to refrain from speculative arguments about maybe, well, you said maybe what's behind the curtain, because, well, as a politician, I like to take the world as it is and not how it maybe should be in the future somewhere farther down the line.
Thanks very much. I guess I'd quite like to take a little bit of issue, Michael, with the pace of change point. and also with the point about transhumanism at the same time. Because I've recently moved to Brussels and been here 3 months, and I was trying to help my daughter out on her holidays, and I wanted to give her some euros. It's like, I'm being paid in euros, so hey, bingo, I don't have to pay any transaction fees, nor do you. And so I set her up a Starling bank account. I said, look, come over here. And I was just seeing her for Sunday lunch. Look, get your phone out. Have you got your passport with you? She just got back from Lisbon. And within 10 minutes from having a photo ID, she had a bank account. 10 seconds later, I'd transferred her £10, to make sure the account was working. And then I transferred her some euros, and it's like, didn't come through. Oh my God, what happened? It's all gone wrong. But that was the thing that you were talking about, the problem of transferring between countries. The next day, she got the euros, okay? This is phenomenal, okay? And I think everybody is quite happy with adapting to that. And that sort of stuff is like, people go, yeah, that makes my life better. Where the problem, so it's not, I don't think it's the speed of change. I think the problem is the political framing. So where people get concerned, and then it comes back to the woke points, and they're being nudged all the time through this technology, nudged into doing things they don't want to do. That's where the confusion is. And that's why you need some clarity. So when you start talking about the importance of freedom of speech, that's what we need more of. We need more people providing the clarity about what being a human is. We don't need to worry about becoming transhumans. We need to talk about what the important values of what being a human is. And then we can get on and use the technology in really exciting ways. And it seems to me no surprise that technology and technocracy go together. I mean, it's a really good way of regulating things, but we shouldn't let it. We shouldn't let the technology be governed by the technocracy. We should take back control.
I think that's exactly the case. If you, for example, look at what's the discussion around this European digital identity, I think it got way out of control. If you look at the vocabulary of European institutions of what it could be, I mean, you can make all kinds of things of what it would become. But essentially, it's basically, in the Netherlands, we have something called DigiD, which is just you know, if you move to, I moved from Leiden to Oegstgeest, a little village. I typed it in my DigiD, bam, I was moved. Great. Well, with the European digital identity, they just want to register your passport. And then you can, for example, when I move to Brussels or to France or whatever, I can just log in and say, I moved to France. Bam, it's done. So that's phenomenal. But then you have these vocabularies behind, well, which is seen as added potential, added values by the European Commission that could be added to this certain product. Well, you can make everything of it. And I think that's also what I notice when I'm in the European Parliament, when I'm talking to the European Commission, is just talk, just regular, normal language. Just be down to earth. Just make sense of these things because, and then back to my point, we are now living in a world that's moving faster than ever, and it's difficult for people to catch up. And if you are looking into everything that is theoretically possible, well, if you connect the dots in a certain way, then we're already in a sort of dystopian 1980s Blade Runner type society. And I don't believe that's the case, but they're certainly making a case for themselves by communicating in this way.
Yeah, I agree with what you said, and I think there's a piggybacking on the back of obviously good things that always happens, and they, you know, it tends to be that political agenda will instrumentalize virtue, value, in this case, clear value, but in terms of virtue, you know, tolerance, give peace a chance. I mean, a lot of the watchwords for what we consider woke now are obvious virtues we would all agree with in a very basic sense if understood in a certain way. That's also why terms end up mutating in this odd sort of way. And so I think separating the wheat from the chaff, and sometimes there's more of one than the other. Actually, it's not so clear that there's initially not more benefit than liability coming by way of some of these technologies when they are incorporated organically into existing structures and not treated as a weapon against existing structures. Even in terms of European Union policy, because, you know, we can be very negative, There are smart specialization agendas that are applied at the regional level, regional smart specialization. A lot of that was drafted by local governments, very normal politicians that have nothing to do with any odd commission conditioning, and they're perfectly fine. And actually, they make a lot of sense. They respond to local needs. We don't need to scrap that, you know. So you're right. You're right to make that distinction, I think. And it's good to know that if there's something gangrenous, that doesn't mean we have to cut off the whole limb. It might be that the gangrene is more localized than sometimes we're tempted to think. Yeah.
Sorry.
Sure. Is there a microphone? Yes. Great.
I can talk now.
It's better for the recording. Thanks.
Yeah. I wanted to ask the panel if there is a way to avoid becoming a model citizen and a transhuman.
I didn't hear the question.
Is there a way to avoid becoming a model citizen or a transhuman?
I'd argue, because I do believe in rule of law, I do both perspective from my research as well as lobbying somehow within the institutions, and I truly believe that we can make something out of it. My simple answer is vote well. My simple answer is make sure that we have some pragmatic people that do respect human values, that want to do something, make something up from the European Union, and less the power of the European Commission. And I'd add the European Court of Human Rights has too much power as well. So yeah, basically it's a huge agenda here that I'm offering, but I think we could definitely do something out of it and step out of this modeling and naming and shaming. And one side remark, I still don't understand why the Greens are so technologically avid. I really it doesn't I can't make sense of anything of that sort.
I think that would be a fantastic topic for a future panel. We could probably devote an hour's discussion to that. Are there other questions? Yes, there's a question in the back.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's very interesting discussion so far, so thank you very much for organizing this. I very much share the concerns that Letitia made, expressed so clearly. The problem we have with the AI law is that the AI Act is that it will only enter into force in 3 years' time. And given the breakneck speed of the evolution of AI, what can we do? You already kind of suggested to lay the power back to the people and say, okay, where do we want to go as citizens? So in the next 3 years, before we have this AI law, what can we do? What would you recommend us to do as conservatives in our societies?
Well, you've all heard of the Elon Musk's initiative to pause developments over ChatGPT. That's the tip of the iceberg, but this pause AI demonstration going on now, I think that would be definitely my perspective and my proposition. But of course, is this feasible since we don't have the technology? What is it we can pause since the EU doesn't have technology? And we want to foster innovation. And innovation in France, if I take some of the SMEs that I've spoken about and AI experts that I've spoken about are really keen on sovereignty, technology sovereignty. So we need to set up our standards. We need to make sure that the not only the human rights framework come from us, but remember the Bluetooth standard came from Europe. Remember ISO quality control thing comes from Europe. So we do have some good initiatives, but that was the good old days when we had technology, and we don't have any of that sort anymore. So it's hard to put a circle in a square really.
I think actually your question, your comment is a great way for us to end with concluding remarks from the other two panelists as well. This question of what can we do?
Sorry, what can we do on what?
Given that these acts are going to happen in the future, what can we do today? Things are moving at a breakneck pace. So the question is, what do we do now?
Well, I think it's first and foremost very important that we have people within the European institutions that are, and I really liked the thing that you said earlier, is that it's more locally organized. I think democracy is something that is best suited to the nation state. I think if it goes beyond the nation state, it becomes more of a technocratic exercise that carries no legitimacy towards its people. And I think that how to move forward, I think just to put it very broadly, is to put it back more locally. What does it mean for the people? If I come back to the file I'm working on right now, the instant payments, I tend to think, what does this mean for the people? How can your daughter transfer euros to pounds and you have it within a second? That's something that's of added value. And I think that's something that we need to keep in the back of our mind. And the solution in the institutions, the European institutions, is always bigger is better. Europe does things better. That's not always the case. So I think in terms of, if you look at AI, if we look at the digital currency, if we look at all kinds of technological advancements, try to narrow it down, try to put it on a human level, because otherwise we might lose that perspective.
Yeah, I think that's right. There's a conceptual sort of inversion where bigger is better. So instead of the principle of subsidiarity, where you keep these larger structures as accountable as possible, I have no problem scaling up, obviously, but you have to have a mechanism in place for that, and a civic consciousness that's tantamount to that challenge, because there's always going to be a creep, an institutional creep at the top, or you always have that risk. And that kind of goes hand in hand with the idea that, no, high tech first, bigger better than smaller, high tech better than low tech. And that's not true. It's not true because it's not practical. The specific needs of the citizenry are not being respected at that point, but also because it isn't congruent with the notion of human flourishing that most of us have. Most of us know it's better to memorize a number if it's only, you're going to use it a few times, then write it down or use a calculator or whatever else instead of doing math in your head. You know that. So there's also a sense in which it contradicts our idea of human, of what the subject should be, how easily a subject should be able to interact with its environment. Normativity comes in at that point, right? It's not just about the institutions, it's about how we promote a concept of what the human subject is, to your question before. Obviously, what we do on that level, prayer, religion, that would be my answer. And other people perhaps would come to similar conclusions instinctively in terms of what the human being is and how you answer that question. I think you do have to answer that question. I don't think you get away with not answering that question, because Nietzsche had this phrase that, this anecdote, you remove the statue of the Buddha, but his shadow is still there, oddly. But then it starts to fade. So if you live in a society that is sheltered by institutions that were built by people who had a specific faith and worldview, you don't notice how necessary that worldview is. But then it starts to fade, and everything starts to get a little harder, and you get these very bad ideas. So I think that you do have to answer those big questions as well.
I think we're going to have to wrap it up there. A few notes, thinking of the human level, leaving things at the human level. Please look for announcements for our late June panel on security migration. And then in September, we'll have a conference dedicated to this concept and question of transhumanism. And we really hope that we can continue this very deep conversation there. So I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank our audience here. I want to thank anyone who's watching this video. And we look forward to seeing you next time.